Simon comes to us from Duke University, where he's an assistant professor in public policy and Slavic and Eurasian studies at Duke's Stanford School of Public Policy. His research focuses on grand strategy, nuclear weapons, and Cold War international history. And obviously, his talk today will be solidly in that domain. I will just note that this time period is also special because this is the time period in which CSAC itself was born, out of many of the concerns, in fact, that Simon, I think, will be talking about today. So it's great to have you here at CSAC. And so Simon's going to talk to us for a while, and then we'll open it up for discussion and conversation. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Colin, and thank you, Scott, for extending the invitation, and thank you, Emily, for making it all happen. It's a real pleasure to be here with you in sunny California to talk about somewhat grimmer subjects. In today's case, the alleged near miss with nuclear war surrounding Able Archer 83, NATO's command staff exercise of November 1983. And this project, just to give you a little context, comes out of a broader book which is, I've just been informed, forthcoming in October, on October 15th, 2020, called Engaging the Evil Empire, which is a history of US-Soviet relations in the first half of the 1980s, drawing on American and Soviet and various Eastern Bloc archival materials. And this is, to many people, the episode of the early 1980s, one of the hot button issues of that period and also of Cold War history as a whole. Now, of course, whether or not the world almost ended one November day in 1983 is, I think, an intrinsically important historical question to all of us sitting here after 1983, but it's also a major part of the Cold War zeitgeist. For example, some of you may be familiar with the German TV show Deutschland 83, which depicts this exact event unfolding from the perspective of an East German spy working in the West, in the senior echelons of the West German military. And I should be very clear that though the topic of my paper today is how Able Archer 83 was not a brush with nuclear war, I, like many, started out an Able Archer 83 believer because it was omnipresent in the literature. And I won't bore you with the extent to which that's the case, but I will tell you that when I first delved into this issue as a graduate student, I did what most graduate students do, is I started mining the footnotes and chasing down the footnotes of those footnotes. And what I uncovered and what really started this skeptical project was the extent of circular citation in the literature. And I found that the story actually hinges on a very, very narrow evidentiary basis. I'll go into that in a minute. What I want to start with is to tell you what Able Archer 83 was. I imagine not all of you spend as much time as I do immersed in the history of the 1980s, which is all to the good. Able Archer 83 was a NATO command post exercise which rehearsed the escalation from conventional to nuclear war using intermediate range nuclear forces, American intermediate range nuclear forces, forward deployed in Europe, in this case primarily in West Germany. It was a part of the Autumn Forge 83 series of regular exercises held by NATO, which rehearsed various aspects of what general war would look like on land, at sea, and in the air. And it involved some missiles, Pershing 1A intermediate range ballistic missiles that were required in order to carry out the command and control aspect of the exercise, right? In order to practice command and control, you need something to command and control, but it certainly did not involve anything like a large quantity of nuclear forces. NATO planners who wrote the scenario for the exercise based it on the real tensions of the early 1980s. So the story, the scenario, begins with a series of proxy wars that the Soviet Union fights with the United States in the Middle East, which then lead to a Soviet invasion of Yugoslavia, which then leads to a Soviet invasion of Finland, which then leads to a Soviet invasion of Norway. And then finally, The Soviet army crosses the Fulda Gap on the 4th of November, aided by the liberal use of chemical weapons. In response to this, NATO executes the doctrine of escalation to de-escalate by nuking an Eastern European city in order to try to deter further Soviet incursions. And by the 11th of November, according to the scenario, the world is plunged into full nuclear war. Now, that being said, I want to stake out the ground of what Able Archer was not, and this is where I differ from much of the conventional wisdom on this topic. So the conventional wisdom has it that the Warsaw Pact, in particular the Soviet Union, but also the East Germans and the Czechs, observing the exercise, believed that it was cover for a NATO surprise nuclear attack. That the Pershing 1As would actually fire, that they weren't just going through the motions. And this tracked with Warsaw Pact military operational planning. Because, as we saw, for example, in 1968 in Czechoslovakia, the use of exercises as cover for mass mobilization was a pretty common practice in their approach to warfighting. I should mention that nobody actually involved in the exercise had the authority to launch nuclear attacks. Many people have suggested, for example, that Margaret Thatcher was in the bunker as the exercise was playing out. We now have access to all of Margaret Thatcher's diaries, and we know where she was. She wasn't even in the UK for half of it, and she was meeting with such officials as the head of the Commonwealth and Canadian Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who is the father of our current Prime Minister, Pierre Trudeau. And then finally, that there was no supercomputer in the Lubyanka, the famous operation or project RIaN, which is the acronym for Raketno-Ядерное нападение, which means nuclear missile attack, a Soviet attempt to bring, during a kind of a resurgence of the cybernetics movement, to bring computers and data to bear on rapid intelligence analysis. But the main point, and this is the results that I found of extensive archival research throughout the former Warsaw Pact, is that nothing about this warranted the attention of key Warsaw Pact and Soviet policy makers. So today, briefly, I want to cover 4 areas. First, I want to talk a little bit about historiography and how the Able Archer myth came to be. Then I want to talk about the KGB's operation or project RIaN and dispel the myth that it led the Soviets to see Able Archer 83 as cover for a nuclear first strike. Then I want to talk about what the Warsaw Pact actually saw, because we have the documents on this, and we know what was going through the minds and was coming across the desks, to be more precise, of the policymakers who mattered when it came to assessing this type of threat. Now, the longevity of this myth comes from the fact that it has, I think, extraordinary explanatory power for understanding not just the Cold War in the 1980s, not just the so-called Second Cold War, but the Cold War as a whole. First of all, it captures the real tense atmosphere of the 1980s, that palpable sense that things in the nuclear arms race and in superpower relations could very well go off the rails, as Colin mentioned, which motivated folks like those at Stanford to stand up a place like CSAC. It sums up the real stakes of the very real crises of this time over Lebanon, Grenada, the downing of Korean Airlines Flight 7, and the stationing of new American intermediate-range nuclear forces in Europe. It explains, or at least can explain, Ronald Reagan's seemingly dramatic change of course vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, heralded in his 1984 Ivan and Anya speech. It has, I think it's fair to say, all of the hallmarks of a great Cold War story. Spies, supercomputers, American tanks destroying West German farmers' fields. It's got kind of all of the great aspects of the Cold War stories which we love to consume in the media. And it speaks to the very real dangers of nuclear weapons, in particular of nuclear saber rattling, and how that very well could spin out of control. But what this literature lacks, and what my contribution here, is to bring Soviet and Warsaw Pact perspectives into the conversation. I would argue that a lack thereof is a fatal flaw when the core of the story is Soviet and Warsaw Pact perception. And there is, among scholars who look at this episode and this period, a very strong positive correlation between those relying on more Russian sources and those who are less convinced of the war scare narrative. Now, the source on Able Archer 83 is the man on the right, Oleg Gordievsky, who was a senior officer in the KGB's station in London, the Rezidentura. He was not actually the head of that, though he was promoted to be head of the Rezidentura in London, but before he could take up his office, he was outed as a spy. He was, for a long time, a double agent who was passing information to the British, who then defects in July 1985 after he's compromised and is recalled to Moscow, and he narrowly escapes from the Soviet Union, leaving behind his wife and family. And so once Gordievsky comes to the United Kingdom, he begins telling his story. An interesting story, a salacious story, which is published in venues, for example, like a great book, which doesn't, I think, get read enough, by a journalist called Gordon Brooke Shepherd, called The Stormbirds, which is a series of interviews with KGB defectors to the United Kingdom, as opposed to the defectors to the United States, who generally had a bit more of a high profile, in which Gordievsky claims that the Kremlin pressed what came close to a panic button. And in a book co-authored with the eminent historian of intelligence, Christopher Andrew, KGB it's called, Gordievsky talks about flash telegrams on the 8th or the 9th of November, 1983, saying that Able Archer 83, and I quote, marked the beginning of preparations for a nuclear first strike. Now, those telegrams have not been found. Gordievsky himself has not been able to reproduce them, but this is the story that Gordievsky tells us about 1983, and which piqued the attention of observers early on. Interest has been reinvigorated after the 2015 release of a report produced by the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, a group of non-intelligence community practitioners or experts, or sometimes just friends of the president, who come together to provide, we could say, sober second thought on issues relating to intelligence. And the origins of this document, and I see it in front of Scott there, the origin of this document actually comes from the Able Archer time. A man named Leonard Perutz, who was a lieutenant general at the time. He was the head of intelligence for U.S. Air Force in Europe at the time of Able Archer and Autumn Forge. He then directed the Defense Intelligence Agency later on. And when he left that position at the end of the 1980s, he fired off a final memo in which he said, I was there during Able Archer, and what I saw looked like the Soviets preparing for a preemptive strike. I want you, the intelligence community, to undertake a review of what happened, and we need to get to the bottom of this. Perutz was absolutely convinced that the world almost ended in 1983. That review was initially conducted by the intelligence community itself. It confirmed that there was no near miss with nuclear war, and then Perutz took his case to the PIFIAB. And the PIFIAB report is often presented as a smoking gun, proving that the world came to the brink, so to speak. I think a reading of this document tells a very, very different story. It's true, as the PIFIAB report says, and as anyone who lived through the era can attest to, that tensions were very high. But the document stops short on many, many occasions of actually saying that the Soviet Union believed that there was a real danger of nuclear attack. And also, critically, I think, introduces little to no new evidence on Soviet and Warsaw Pact perceptions at the time. It is perhaps the case that something is in there behind that redaction blackout material. That being said, the Perutz letter, for example, which prompted this, will be coming out in the latest edition of the Foreign Relations of the United States series, which covers US-Soviet relations from 83 to 85. And that document, that volume is actually at the printers now. It's cleared declassification. But I want to really stress that to say that the Soviet Union did not believe that nuclear war was in the offing is not to say that the 1980s were not a tense time. And this is a key aspect for all of us in thinking about international security and decision-making. That is, disaggregating atmospherics from the actual risk of war. This was, I think it's very clear from the Soviet documents, an atmosphere created in large part by Kremlin officials who were using war rhetoric in order to justify more and more spending on the military, more and more spending on guns at the expense of butter, at a time when Soviet citizens and citizens throughout Eastern Europe were calling out for more butter, or at least some margarine. Andrei Alexandrov Agentov, who was the foreign policy advisor to a string of Soviet general secretaries, writes very explicitly, "We scared our own people." Yuri Andropov, who's general secretary at the time, formerly head of the KGB, is very worried at this time about nuclear war, but not about an American surprise attack, but rather about the consequences of miscalculation, about mistakes, about misperception. He says to his counterpart in East Germany, the head of the Stasi, Erich Mielke, the United States is preparing for war, but is not willing to start a war. They are not building factories and palaces in order to destroy them. That being said, the zeitgeist is one of war. This is a still from the TV film The Day After, which, to the best of my knowledge, still holds the record for the most watched made-for-TV movie in American broadcasting history. And this is, you can't really make it out very clearly, this is the charming town of Lawrence, Kansas, being destroyed by a Soviet ICBM. This is also the era of, for example, the chart topper by West German pop group Nena, 99 Luftballons, 99 red balloons, which tells the story of a nuclear war breaking out because of war-hungry military leadership using a false alarm on an early warning system as pretext to plunge the world into nuclear war. This is also the era of Samantha Smith, the young girl from Maine who becomes famous at writing Yuri Andropov a letter asking him if he really wants to destroy her country, the United States, and if he will vote to have a nuclear war or not, which actually catapults Smith into something akin to stardom at the time. And she stars in films and television shows and commercials in the United States briefly until her life is cut short, actually, in a tragic aircraft accident. And it also bears mentioning that this was a time of great uncertainty. And uncertainty did not suit the leaders of the Soviet Union. Those who were in the upper echelons of power in Moscow at this time were those who were on the front lines in 1941, who had lived through the surprise attack of Operation Barbarossa, and who vowed never again to allow their country to be taken by surprise like that again. One issue which was not a surprise to the Soviet leadership was Ronald Reagan. This is a topic I explore in much greater depth in my book, but I just want to mention it now. We have this story that Ronald Reagan fundamentally changes the entire nature of the Cold War on taking office. This would have been news to Moscow. Soviet leaders blamed the, and I'm quoting here, inscrutable and zigzagging Jimmy Carter for reinvigorating the Cold War arms race, abandoning détente, and triggering what we call now the Second Cold War. A memorandum produced for the Central Committee in 1985, right after Ronald Reagan is inaugurated, looking back on the first 4 years of Reagan's foreign policy, concludes that the first Reagan term, foreign policy-wise, was no different to what a second Carter term would have looked like, right down to the launching of the Strategic Defense Initiative. Now, the sense of tension is real We can look, for example, to Reagan's speeches at Westminster, where he pledges us to consign communism to the ash heap of history, or Orlando, where he calls the Soviet Union the evil empire, to American nuclear strategy and the introduction of new precision miniaturized weapons like the MX ICBM, the Trident D5 submarine launch ballistic missile, and of course the Strategic Defense Initiative, which looked to the Kremlin like the toolkit needed to fight a nuclear war. Other incidents from this era, like for example the Canopy Wing exercises, which, to distill down to a very basic level, involved flying nuclear bombers straight at the borders of the Soviet Union and turning away at the last minute, and the Ocean Venture naval exercises around and circling the Soviet Union also certainly were unwelcome to Soviet leaders. And it was also a time of great uncertainty in the West, as the Euro missiles issue, the plan to deploy new American intermediate-range ballistic missiles, Pershing IIs in this case, threatened to break NATO. And scenes like this one, a demonstration by West German soldiers. So these are West German soldiers here in uniform at a massive protest not far away from their own base, which is going to house American nuclear weapons, which they are going to guard. And they are holding a banner, standing in front of a papier-mâché version of those weapons, reading, "NATO soldiers say no to cruise missiles and Pershing IIs." Now think about that in the context of civil-military relations, right? Soldiers taking to the street in uniform to protest the policies which they themselves will be carrying out, in this case, in a manner of just a few months. And in the context of that uncertainty, the Soviet Union wanted any advantage it could get. And one possible advantage was Project RIaN. And I say project as opposed to operations. Often it gets called Operation RIaN, advisedly, because that's actually what the contemporaneous documents refer to it as. Project. It actually lives within the KGB's research and development branch, not within any of the operational directorates, like, for example, the First Chief Directorate, with oversight over foreign intelligence collections. Now, surprise prevention was not a new task for intelligence agencies, including the KGB under this man, Yuri Andropov, who goes on to become General Secretary. But new ideas were coming to the fore, as I said, in the context of this resurgence in cybernetics about computers managing massive inflows of data and seeing what human beings could not. Now, if you want to do that, you've got a few questions that you need to ask, and there are two big ones. So the first one is, what is an indicator of imminent nuclear war? There are four categories of observation: politico-military, intelligence, civil defense, and economics. And by 1986, and I stress to you 1986, 3 years after Able Archer, 292 data points had been finalized. Now, I could talk for hours and hours about all of these, but let me just highlight two for you right now. The first is that the KGB was instructed to monitor very closely fluctuations in the market value of human blood, which is interesting because you cannot, except perhaps on parts of the internet, which it would be best if none of us discussed, buy that product. You can only get it from a hospital. But so focused on the capitalist nature of the American system were enough people in the intelligence agencies of the Pact that they thought that even human blood was commodified. And then the second, and this is on a happier note, was that any historians in the room will be happy to know that the removal of priceless, precious documents of kind of American patrimony, like, for example, the original Constitution from the facility known as Archives 1 on the Mall in Washington, D.C., to secure hardened locations, the transport of key government documents from the National Archives and Records Administration to similar such hardened sites, and also of major works of art in the holdings of American museums. That too was an indicator that perhaps nuclear war was in the offing. Now, the debate over these data points, however, pales in comparison to the bigger question, which is, will this even work? And on that, there was really a clear answer, and that was no. Computer systems were held in extremely low regard by top intelligence officials at the time, especially those which purported to offer early warnings, for example, of incoming ballistic missiles, but which could be triggered by flocks of geese. And this man, Markus Wolf, head of foreign intelligence at the Stasi, is on the record multiple times saying that the entirety of RIaN was a fool's errand and went absolutely nowhere. RIaN, it bears mentioning, is totally shut down, having never really come into being just 1 month before the Soviet Union ceases to exist. Able Archer was nothing new to the Warsaw Pact. The Autumn Forge series of exercises took place every year. Their scope varied, but nuclear use was always part of it. In fact, in the estimation of East German and Czechoslovak military intelligence, who were actually the primary observers of the exercise, delegated by the KGB, 1983 was a pretty quiet version. It didn't involve any of the key players who would be needed to actually do the things they were rehearsing, and it only involved about 253,000 troops, whereas prior years had involved up to as many as 410,000 troops. So we have, for example, East German intelligence briefings ranging from more raw intelligence all the way up to briefings for Erich Honecker, the head of the East German party and state, by his defense minister, Heinz Hoffmann, which note the nuclear use scenario with sanguinity and indicate explicitly that there's no indication that this actually belies any change in the assessment of the international order by NATO. It also stresses that they were able to listen to NATO's nuclear release communication system. So not the verbal order which would be given to launch, but rather the kind of the electronic signals linking the weapons with their command and control stations, which they were confident they could detect what a launch sounded like in code. And then this, which is the Czechoslovak military intelligence report on all of Autumn Forge, including Able Archer. This is the cover. I took this photo in the archives in Prague. Also mentions at length what happened during the exercise, but mentions nothing untoward. Now, what was happening did merit notice at the tactical level. So there was some heightened activity at Soviet air bases in East Germany and Poland, as well as at some Soviet ICBM installations. I want to make 2 points on this, because this is at the core of the story that the Soviets really believed that an attack was coming. First, this behavior is completely in line with Soviet activity during major NATO exercises. It is still in line with the behavior of various US adversaries when the United States exercises its military, especially on a large scale. This is basic counter-signaling, right? You're out there driving your fancy stuff around, flying your stuff around. We're going to remind you that we're here, we're watching you, we're aware, and we are also not to be trifled with. But, and this is, I think, the critical point, the nuclear alert level is lowered in the Soviet Union at exactly the time when the nuclear use portion of Able Archer 83 begins. And this asynchronicity of time, I think, tells us a great deal about the tranquility with which the Soviet Union actually observed what was going on in the NATO exercises. And finally, and this becomes a much bigger issue later on, Soviet officials knew that the Pershing 1As, which were stationed in West Germany, which were part of the Able Archer exercise, could not reach Moscow, though they could reach important Eastern European cities. Why this matters in particularly is because at the end of November is when those missiles are being replaced with a weapon that the Soviet leadership was absolutely convinced could hit Moscow, and thus made for a much more effective, if you will, surprise attack weapon. They were actually wrong that the Pershing IIs could reach Moscow as they were outfitted and deployed by the United States, though it was within the technical capacity of the missiles. But they were adamant that this was the case. And finally, key Soviet officials dismissed the idea that Able Archer had them worried about a nuclear war. There is a long list, and I get into this in the paper, I won't recite it all to you now, of foreign ministry, general staff, Politburo, and other officials who explicitly reject Gordievsky's telling of the episode as a near miss with nuclear war. And this is, I should mention, a common topic in oral histories, for example, and the answer is the same. In fact, some of the Soviet interviewees become really frustrated with their interlocutors who keep on asking them about this thing which happened in late November 1983, which they have, and these are people from the KGB and military intelligence, which they have no recollection about. Anatoly Dobrynin, who is the Soviet ambassador to the United States, has a whole section in his Russian language memoirs called, "Was the Soviet Union Afraid of a US Nuclear Attack?" His answer is negative. The Politburo records from the time, especially those of the 15th and the 24th of November, make no mention of this episode. Yuri Andropov, whom I introduced to you earlier as the general secretary at this time, is not a well man. His kidneys were failing, and so many important meetings were held at his bedside in the hospital and not in the halls of the Kremlin. But we have testimony, for example, from his bodyguard and from his protege, Mikhail Gorbachev, that nothing of this sort was actually discussed. We also know that even when Andropov was unwell, in times of crisis, the Politburo did meet. And thus the absence of a meeting is indicative of the absence of crisis in the minds of Soviet policymakers. For example, on the 2nd of September, in the aftermath of the Soviet shootdown of Korean Airlines Flight 7 en route from New York to Seoul, South Korea, the Politburo meets, chaired by the man who would succeed Andropov, Konstantin Chernenko. We do have some evidence that Reagan saw reports about this Soviet counter-signaling and worried what this would mean for Soviet behavior, and that this was part of his impetus for giving the famous Ivan and Anya speech on the 16th of January 1984, in which he extends the olive branch, so to speak, to the Soviet Union. Now, I detail this in much greater length in my book, but that outreach was actually long underway. It goes public in 1984. And this is an interesting case because generally when we think about misperception in international affairs, misperception is a bad thing, right? If you read sort of the seminal works by Bob Jervis on the topic, misperception leads to bad things happening. Here we actually have a case of perhaps misperception leading to a good thing happening in American foreign policy choices. I also want to stress an important point about thinking about Able Archer in the context of nuclear crises in the Cold War. The universe of cases of nuclear crisis in the Cold War is, and throughout history, is a tiny one. Many of them detailed by Scott in his book on nuclear accident. We don't have a lot of data points on this issue. And thus changing just one of those points, in this case, Able Archer, has a significant impact on our conception of the whole. So while this is just one case, it carries a lot of weight, I think, in the conversation, which is so stymied by overclassification, perfectly legitimate classification, and obliviousness. And as we look at a future world without an INF treaty, the treaty which took those Pershing IIs, as well as the Griffin ground-launched cruise missiles which accompanied them, and the SS-20 Soviet missiles which prompted the introduction of the Pershing IIs and the Glickems, fears mount over an arms race in Europe, and topics and conversation trends towards the issue of what if we have another major nuclear crisis. Able Archer does not mean that we will never have a nuclear crisis. I think the odds are low in large part because the President of the United States is on the record as taking a very dim view of provocative military exercises, especially provocative military exercises which are targeted or at least aimed at the audience of regimes he likes. He's on the record on this, for example, about the Korean Peninsula. I think it's fair to say that the Putin regime would occupy a similar place in his view. But also what Abel Archer and a wider range of the historical work I've done on the Soviet military tells us is that trigger fingers in Moscow, at least during the Cold War, were not itchy. That Soviet policymakers and military and civilian alike took very seriously the threat of nuclear war, took very seriously the threat and danger of accidental nuclear war, and took steps to try to prevent it. And that Soviet doctrine and Russian doctrine in practice today still carries a lot of the hallmarks of that earlier Soviet period. So to sum up, I think, and I am of course enormously biased in this viewpoint, that Abel Archer is a perfect case for the importance of international history and for the centrality of doing international research to the enterprises which we're all engaged in, which is understanding international security and cooperation. Foreign policy matters as much in its intent as it does in the eye of the beholder, just like actions, strategies, and even operations do. In the case of Abel Archer, that other side of the story is missing. And that other side of the story, the Warsaw Pact side of the story, is at the essence of the entire question. It is entirely possible that some in the West came to believe that Abel Archer 83 almost led to a nuclear war, that there is ample documentation for Western sources to support this belief, and that they were entirely wrong. And with that, I'll look forward to taking your questions. Thank you.
You're in an odd position, I think, as a scholar going into a story that pre-exists in people's minds, where somehow the burden of proof is on you to show that it didn't happen, even though you're finding nothing. And then we, as an audience or your readers, are going to be in a position of saying, well, am I convinced that he saw enough of the documents that he would have found the documents that this guy that others have been referring to had he been doing all the right research? So it's an odd position of having to prove this negative that I feel like you have, but I think I would be even more convinced if you had told me something about exactly what you were looking for before you went, and then what you found and what you didn't, right? So the question, as Fred's question, was, what were your predictions ahead of time about what you needed to see and not see in the archive to believe that your case, that this didn't happen? Right? What could we go in the archives with basic baseline predictions?
So what I was originally looking for in the archives was proof that it did happen, because that's the big story. I was writing at the time, it was a dissertation on the 80s. Now it's a book. I wanted more granular detail about how the Soviets got totally freaked out and thought that nuclear war was coming. So actually the archival research, most of the archival research for the project, which I present here arguing as I just did, was gathered from a mindset of the very opposite, right? Was that I wasn't going to refute the Abel Archer story. I was going to tell it with the Warsaw Pact documents, which hadn't been brought into the conversation enough. So that was procedurally, you know, how the thing came about. And then it was what I was finding that changed my mind, literally in the archives, as I was poring over the materials that I was getting in Berlin, Prague, Kiev, and various other places. Proving a negative is really hard. So what I found is, one, at a variety of levels, right? So it wasn't just people at the top who were on message, so to speak. It was, yes, people at the top, people like Gorbachev and senior intelligence officials as well, but also people in more kind of middle management roles, and also all the way down to specific assets in the field. So for example, an East German spy by the name of Rainier Rupp spent all of Able Archer 83 at NATO headquarters in Brussels and cabled back that there was nothing untoward. So that's the first big kind of confidence booster that I get from the documents that I have, is multiple levels of individual are saying the same story. They're on the sound. They're on the same message. The other level is multiple different countries, right? So this is an international story. This is a story about Czechoslovak. This is a story about East German. And this is a story about Soviet officials who are all also saying the same thing, but are reaching their conclusions independently, because they are doing different types of surveillance and analysis. Rupp is reporting, for example, first and foremost to the East Germans. The Czechoslovaks are literally watching the thing happen from observation posts. So they are also saying the same thing based on different inputs. They are, again, kind of on the same message. And then finally, I don't really, and I thought about this a lot. I thought, well, couldn't all of these people just be lying?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, couldn't they all be lying? And that's a tough one, because that is also true of basically all documents ever created by human beings. We don't have a good answer to that question. But the fact that so many individuals were saying it, the fact that they were saying it in closed channels, and that a lot of this stuff was recounting, for example, conversations, memoranda of conversation, which were dated, and we could be confident about their veracity, in which they were, in which these memcons are discussing either specifically Able Archer, like for example the briefing by the East German defense minister for the East German General Secretary. That gives me a lot of confidence. Am I absolutely certain that there's not a smoking gun out there? Of course, I would be lying to you if I said no. If any historian tells you that there's, that they're absolutely certain that there's no archival evidence that contradicts their thesis, she or he is probably lying to you. But I'm very confident, and I'm also confident that this is at least a step in the right direction of furthering our understanding of not just this episode, but of the Cold War as a whole.
Yeah. Did you have a two-finger, Colin?
Yeah, kind of.
And then I'll go down.
A quick two-finger. Great talk. Excellent empirical work, and I really enjoyed it. Didn't know a lot about Able Archer 83. And I think we should understand the Cold War better. But I guess I have a question following off of what you just said about better understanding. In terms of how you frame your understanding, you said you're interested in disaggregating atmospherics from actual events. And I wonder, you're probably familiar, there's a famous book by a Frenchman, Jean Baudrillard, The Desert War. The Desert Storm did not happen. We're essentially making the claim that atmospherics are what actual events in modern wars are designed to create, and that outside of this question of atmospherics and perception, actual events can't be understood. And essentially saying winning hearts and minds is more of a active theater than boots on the ground, let's say. And so it seems like in this case, it's very nice. These actual events and atmospherics you've managed to disaggregate, but in more contemporary cases after the Cold War, do you think this will be even possible?
Well, of course, the quantity of both signal and noise has increased, if not perhaps beyond geometrically, like logarithmically, in not a lot of time, for which we can probably blame a great many of people within just a few miles of where we're all sitting here. Yes, I do think it's going to become harder, and I think technology is going to make it harder. Technology is also going to make it harder to do the disaggregating because you can create events. We could talk for a long time about things like deep fakes and various tools that are being used by a variety of countries in order to manufacture truth. That is going to get a lot harder. If it's any consolation, the Soviets were worried about this type of event. They were worried about being overwhelmed by atmospherics and that creating very untoward events. And so they actually put into place various protocols, including most famously a tool or a system which is referred to by some as perimeter, by some as the dead hand. So the dead hand is mostly talked about as a mutually assured destruction tool, right? That you could turn it on and there were sensors. I won't go into the full details unless someone really wants to get into this. And that's part of the story. But according to a lot of Soviet officials, there's another part of the story. And that is that they knew that in the run-up to when you really should launch a nuclear weapon, things were going to get really tense. And there was going to be a lot of pressure from a lot of different angles to push the button, when maybe you shouldn't go pushing that button. So part of the idea of the dead hand, as the Soviet military officials who put it together and the general staff saw it, was actually to give the general secretary atmospheric insurance, such that he could say, okay, there's a lot of evidence that things are scary. I'm going to activate this, and it's going to look for the cold, hard facts. Dead hand does not get influenced by atmospherics. It is influenced by seismographs, radiation measures, barometric sensors, light sensors, and that's what's going to actually do the retaliating. Not a person overwhelmed by atmospherics, but a concrete, hard and fast measure of events. Unlike RIaN, that is actually deployed. We're fuzzy on the exact years, early to mid 80s. 85 is a pretty good guess, and it's still, to the best of our knowledge, this has been confirmed recently by people in the Russian Strategic Rocket Forces, it's still actually in operation, waiting to be switched on by the Kremlin. But thank you, that's a really good question.
So why don't we work Deepak back to column this way, and then we'll open it up. So, and make sure that Simon knows who you are too. So say.
I heard the Colin banter earlier, so I was good at that.
Right. So I'm Deepak Das. I'm a pre-doctoral fellow over here, and
Hi, Deepak.
My PhD at Cornell in government, and I look at nuclear crises as well and nuclear force postures. So my question to you is actually related to the idea of whether this was a nuclear crisis or not, and I'm wondering what, to your mind, is a nuclear crisis then, because I've seen lists with the Cienfuegos submarine base being a nuclear crisis.
Yeah.
Like 1956 being a nuclear crisis, there's the Taiwan Straits crisis, of course. And of course, then there's, in later years, Kargil, 2001 Parliament attack, which did not actually have, well, two sides fight or fuel their nuclear weapons at all. And so there is a sense that maybe any crisis that involves some form of escalation between two nuclear armed states is a nuclear crisis, which is a very broad sort of way of understanding it. And this may potentially fall within that, if one is to think of that in those terms. So just definitionally, what you consider to be a nuclear crisis, what are the metrics of that, and what metrics does this not meet?
Yeah, I've thought a lot about this, and this is kind of one of the challenges, is that we can all kind of come up with our own operating definitions, and thus different things meet different people's definitions. So all I can do is tell you mine, and with which you may believe is reasonable, and which you may think is not. My litmus test in thinking about a crisis is that it takes two to tango, put very simply. Is that a nuclear crisis, as I think of it, requires a degree of cognizance on the part of the other party, that just one side's behavior or misbehavior isn't quite enough. And the reason for this, kind of the two to tango line, why I have this in my head is, I assure you, not just because I'm trying to create more opportunities for international historians to say, aha, my methodologies alone can solve this problem, though that is a not unwelcome ancillary benefit. It's that when you go beyond that into just the one party kind of crisis, there the taxonomy becomes extremely complicated and extremely messy. And you have a range of events ranging from, as we saw, for example, in the 90s in a Russian submarine base, electrical failures trigger the crisis, to, bad actors, misperception, et cetera, triggering the crisis. That is a huge range of types of events, which I'm not confident it makes sense to lump all together into one. So I take a pretty narrow view of this, again, with the kind of the two to tango litmus test, but that's, of course, a kind of a definition or a taxonomy which someone could challenge, and perhaps seeing your two fingers in the air, you're about to.
Yeah, because I'm just thinking, in the world where preemptive strikes exist, does two to tango necessarily make a nuclear crisis? Because one side could, you mentioned Bob Jones and misperception, one side could misperceive signals and conduct a preemptive strike, in which case you need not have a second actor tango.
Yeah. So the preemptive strike is the weakest point of this, this argument, and the one which doesn't fit very nicely with it. So my short answer to you is that in this case, what you don't necessarily need to have, in that type of scenario, you don't need to have perfect knowledge of events, but you need to have action and reaction. You need to have cause and effect. And so that kind of is a way of separating out, for example, wild misperceptions, which are still a crisis event, but are, I think, a different type of phenomenon. And also, just behaviors ranging from the reckless to the suicidal on the part of individual actors. But it's a really good question, and one which, we need a whole afternoon to hash out. But I think there's a lot to that issue, and I know your work, for example, on the Cargill episode, and that's a really interesting one, which is single party.
Okay, so thank you for your presentation. This is the second one I've seen on Able Archer. The first was from Nate. I think his last name is Jones.
It is, yeah.
Okay, and I have a technical background, so, but don't worry, I'm not going to question you on metrics.
Thank you. I appreciate your magnanimity.
So I do radioactive waste management. I look at, how we're going to deal with the waste produced from this era. But my recollection of Nate's presentation was that it was the U.S. misinterpreting the Soviet response, what we thought was the Soviet response to our military exercise. There was this increase in airspace activity on the Soviet side, and I thought our side misinterpreted that as, oh, maybe they're misinterpreting, maybe they're viewing, I can't remember the specifics, but I thought it ultimately came back to us. Is that not?
Well, you know, I don't want to speak for Nate, who is a friend and whose work I respect a great deal, as I do the work of everyone at the National Security Archive, where until very recently he worked. He actually just got a job doing Freedom of Information Act filing for the Washington Post. So the answer to your question depends on which piece by Nate you read. And there are different cases. So there's the book. There are a few others which have varying kind of accounts, but he repeatedly makes the claim that the Soviet leadership's fingers were on the button, that what they were doing was not just counter signaling, that it was ramping up for a preemptive strike against the United States based on what they saw unfold, what they perceived rather unfolding over the course of Able Archer, and that so as a corollary to that, and as Nate draws primarily on American intelligence documents, I think there's one non-American document in the book that U.S. intelligence is observing the signals of the planes on alert, the ICBM silos going on to a slightly heightened level of alert, and that this is the evidence for the claim that the Soviets kind of had their fingers on the button. But again, I'm not Nate, so I don't want to kind of put words in his mouth, but that is, I think it's fair to say, the argument put forward in the book.
But does your research sort of dispute the possibility that we could, you know, the other side could misinterpretation, and, you know, like regardless of what the Soviets felt around this, like, activity, like, does your research show that the other side can't still, you know, misinterpret whatever could be their activity?
There are a lot of misinterpretations of misinterpretation, so I want to make sure that I get this right. But no, in fact, we have some evidence that some people in the United States, intelligence community and government, thought the Soviets were acting a little funny. They do a thorough review of this. It's done by one of the kind of the preeminent Soviet analysts of the time, a guy by the name of Fritz Ermarth, who writes that and I believe I'm quoting him here, who writes that the Soviets were just rattling their pots and pans, as they did on a regular basis. But certainly in the United States, there was perception of heightened activity, but there was no sense that a preemptive strike was coming, if that follows all the six. Thank you.
Oh, sorry, two finger. Yeah.
So along the intel aspect, so Jennifer Smith-Haven, the military fellow, and also an intelligence officer, pre-doctoral candidate at George Mason School of Public Policy. I look at intelligence oversight. So to Lindsay's point on the intel, which you were just discussing, I was curious about the internal IC investigation and the PIFIAB. Were they looking at the same intel, and how were they interpreting it? Because you said they came at two different conclusions. So can you talk a little bit about their process and some of the personalities probably on the PIFIAB too?
Yeah. So this is an interesting question, right? Why do they reach different conclusions? Well, there's a time lag because Perutz is not happy with the first answer he gets. So he goes to another body of non-intelligence community professionals whom he wants to give him a different answer. So part of the problem is that a lot of the sources are blacked out, are redacted in this. The ones that are open source, and indeed in the characterization of a fellow by the name of Ben Fisher, who is the CIA's official historian, he corroborates this about the entire document. They're really not relying on very much that's new. And what they're relying on for the Soviet perception, which I've harped on this, is really the critical element of this, amounts to very, very little more than Gordievsky's story, albeit not as published in the Stormbirds, KGB, etc., but as told to the British. Now, incidentally, the Soviets have an answer for Gordievsky. Sergei Akhromeyev, who is the last marshal, who's the last chief of the Soviet General Staff, kind of goes for the jugular, and he says Gordievsky is lying. is lying because he wanted to raise his profile, get more money, maybe sell some books, what have you. He totally invents this. I wouldn't go quite that far. At this point in the early 1980s, the pressure to report quantity within the KGB was very, very high. And so people were filing cables about rumors, not treating rumors as fact, but just saying there is a rumor that X, and sending this into the center. So when Gordievsky talks about seeing a cable about Abel Archer, it seems to me as plausible that he might have seen a cable which reported some kind of harebrained kind of rumor about this type of thing. And though I wouldn't claim malice, there is an interesting correlation between when Gordievsky is telling his new colleagues in Britain about Abel Archer, and when he is trying to persuade Margaret Thatcher to launch a covert operation to go and get the family he left behind in the Soviet Union. I can't prove anything, but it is an interesting correlation that this information comes out exactly as, and we have the memos going to Thatcher, which are coincident, where Gordievsky is saying, please, I need you to go and get my wife and my, I think it's one daughter, whom he left behind. This is obviously a pretty sizable undertaking to launch a covert operation into Moscow in the mid-1980s. And it's been suggested, and I'm open to this suggestion, that perhaps that motivated some, at least packaging of this argument. But Fisher, the CIA historian, on the subject of the PIFIAB report, he titles an article on the exact issue. He calls it Scolding Intelligence. Scolding intelligence, that this was done to scold the intelligence agency. Perhaps because this was also during the early years of the Bush administration. The Bush administration, which described itself to the Reagan administration, in which Bush had been vice president, as a hostile takeover of the American national security policy and of the White House. Perhaps that's to a degree a motivator in the extent to which they released the conclusions. But as far as the evidence underlying it, there's not really a lot that's new that's introduced there. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Lauren. I'm also a CSAC fellow in nuclear stuff. But yeah, so but clearly not great at doing intros. Yeah. So
stuff's important.
Yeah. So I had a side question.
Stuff happens.
Stuff happens.
It's called something else when that happens. But yeah. So you mentioned you had looked into this project RIaN and Dead Hand and how it's focused on like key data points. But it seems
292.
It seems like the trend now is to incorporate a lot of data into NC3 and warning. Do you have what are your recommendations after looking at these programs?
Can I pile on it? Because Lauren's question
sure.
is super, and it's like it's a very Silicon Valley question right now. Mm-hmm. So you mentioned two things, or maybe three, but people who are debating the nuclear implications of integrating increasing aspects of artificial intelligence, machine learning, and automation cite three examples from the second what you call the second Cold War, right? Dead Hand in the perimeter system as a fail-safe or fail-deadly, I guess in this case. NC3 system to ensure against decapitation. RIaN, which is like an early version of big data analytics to give long-range strategic warning, and then the third is the Stanislav Petrov incident, right? Which happens like 6 weeks before Abel Archer or something like that.
It's the 23rd of September.
Right, where automated satellite features detect or claim to detect 5 incoming US ICBMs. And it's up to one lieutenant colonel to basically the human being to say, I don't believe it, and to not. So I guess, along with Lauren's point, like what does this period tell us about the dangers or risks or incentives of automation in the nuclear enterprise?
Yeah. So this is this is a question I get a lot when I give this talk. I gave this talk a couple of weeks ago at MIT, and there were a lot of people who were also, from the computer science kind of world who were really interested in this issue. And I should preference my comments with, though my wife's parents are computer scientists, I am not one. Though I do stress that I am the person they call when the Wi-Fi doesn't work.
Because you know the password. That doesn't count.
It's my one thing, Colin. It's all I've got, Colin.
Hope it's not your only.
So, Dead Hand, RIaN, I really love the Petrov episode. I talk about this more in the paper, and with an eye to not consuming too much of your time, I don't talk about it in the presentation. So Petrov is an interesting episode because I think it actually confirms my thesis that there was a very big difference between the atmospherics of war scare and the Soviet leadership actually being afraid of a surprise attack. Because if you're actually afraid of surprise attack, and someone calls you up from a bunker and says, my system says there are 5 ICBMs, Petrov says explicitly that all he did was call and say, cancel this thing, it's a nothing burger. And the general staff says, okay. That is not the behavior of a paranoid group of leaders who think that an attack is coming, right? That they don't ask follow-up questions. And in fact, he is initially promised a cash reward for shutting the thing off rapidly, for not taking it seriously. He's promised a cash reward. Now, he later says that he never got the cash reward, and in fact, which has probably as much to do with the Soviet bureaucracy as any actual, policy choices, and that he's punished, which I think is true. But we actually have a really great account written not by Petrov but by his commanding officer on this entire episode, which you can find the footnote in the paper. It's in Russian, but you can find the footnote in the paper. I'll send you the thing if you read Russian. So the Soviets were really, really skeptical of automation, and intentionally, purposely built human airlocks into these systems, right? So for example, the Dead Hand was not really a doomsday machine, right? So the Dead Hand first had to be turned on. Someone had to proactively turn it on. That's your time of crisis kind of atmospheric disaggregation move. Then the Dead Hand maintained, and here we don't have the best knowledge of this, but we have a pretty good idea. The Dead Hand engaged in regular handshakes, electronic handshakes with the General Staff Command bunker. And for as long as the Dead Hand was confident that there were living people who could trigger a nuclear attack, a retaliation, it wouldn't. So as long as the handshakes kept on getting returned, as long as the circuit was complete or what have you, it wouldn't attack. When those handshakes broke down, then it started listening, looking, and smelling, right? Looking for radiation, seismographs. They had light sensors which were calibrated to what they thought a nuclear bomb the brightness of a nuclear bomb, which is bright. Then it would start looking, listening, and smelling for an attack. And then it would again put control in the hands of a very small group of people who occupied these specially built, perfectly spherical underground bunkers, who would be junior officers. But again, a human being would have to, in these ultra survivable locations, would have to trigger the retaliation. And then what that would do is it would launch a series of actually small missiles with radio transmitters in place of warheads and there. So there's obviously a lot of reasons not to trust the Soviet Union when it comes to science and technology choices, especially when it comes to just what we know the outcomes of the Cold War are. But they were very, very hesitant and built in human beings at key points. Now, RIaN is a tough one because RIaN is never actually operationalized, right? It stays project until about 1986, when people start calling it operation, but it never really actually does what it's supposed to, which is take this whole range of inputs. And I should stress that I mentioned the funny one and the one which as a historian I like, but there are a lot that are really perfectly common sense, right? If all of a sudden a Soviet diplomat is at a cocktail party and everyone from the American side who matters all leaves together and in a hurry, that's a sign that something hinky is up. If the parking lots at the Pentagon or various other places are full overnight, that's a sign. And then, and this is my favorite, they bugged the Domino's pizza phone, where the Pentagon was known to order its pizzas. And you know, this is a sign. If they're ordering large quantities of pizza at 9 o'clock at night or something, then there's a lot of people working the night shift, which means something's afoot. So I wouldn't say that the whole enterprise of trying to take a wide range of inputs to get to Lauren's question and Colin's question is misguided. But I think what Soviet planners knew was something which I think makes a lot of sense, which is that there are points where you need, even in these kinds of quasi-automatic retaliation systems, where it makes sense to put human kind of stopgaps and prevent the machines from making all of the critical choices, just to kind of use them to, in some cases, accelerate the making of those decisions. That being said, I am not a technologist by any stretch of the term, and on the very practical issues of what AI today, I'm not going to lie to you and tell you that I can give you a very good answer, but I'm skeptical.
Wait, hold on. Scott, you're up next. Yeah.
When John Lewis published his first book using Russian and Chinese archives, John Gaddis, in his review, said this was like, for a historian, like seeing the backside of the moon for the first time. And I think what you're doing here is great, because it's seeing the backside of the story about this crisis, or perhaps it wasn't a crisis, this exercise, from the other side. And that's where your big addition is. But I want to encourage you to do two things quite differently, because I think that you have a danger of doing to the historians or the historical record what the PIFIAB was accusing the intelligence community of doing, of going too far in the other direction. Yeah. So my reading of the PIFIAB, so I should say that in '84, I went from the ivory tower of Harvard into a windowless room in the basement of the Pentagon, and was involved in the follow-on exercises to this, right? At the time, people there were beginning to get some notion that the Soviets were saying these are dangerous. I don't remember what the details of Gordievsky were known on the inside at the time. But there was this view that, oh, the Soviets are talking about how dangerous this is to rile up the Germans, to get them so they won't get the P2s in. And they're trying to scare us into not doing our preparations. And that's a bad thing. So when somebody like Fritz Ermatt, a real Cold War hawk, says, oh, the Soviets were just rattling their pots and pans, the PIFIAB is warning against that kind of complacent assumption that the Soviets aren't really scared. My reading of this, I went and got it when I was reading your paper, is that the PIFIAB says in this, we understand that the Special National Intelligence Estimate says that Soviet concerns are just propaganda. We think the evidence does not support such categoric conclusions. Mm-hmm. And as good as I think you've done, I think your evidence doesn't support such categoric conclusions as saying that this was a myth, mm-hmm. that this was a war scare that didn't happen. And therefore, I think just as one story here is how two intelligence groups, the PIFIAB and the National Intelligence Agency, are playing off. One saying the Cold War is not dangerous, our arms race isn't dangerous, the Soviets are lying. The other one saying, hey, look at the evidence and be cautious about it. I think you have to be careful not to say, oh, this is all hunky-dory, nobody in the Soviet Union was worried about it. And the one thing that I think could really push this one step further, besides putting yourself in that context, that is, you're contradicting some not all that great historians like Nate Jones and some others who are just looking at one side and don't have the Russian abilities that you do. So it's great that you're doing that. But the one thing that is still missing here is this notion that you called counter-signaling. Now, the PFIAB says that what the Soviets do in response to this is unprecedented. And they don't give all the details, but they say, you give the ICBM actions, placing Soviet air forces in Germany and Poland in heightened alert. They call this unprecedented.
Yeah.
So it could be that they're wrong and that Soviets had done this in the past, and this was just more signaling where you're doing something, we're getting prepared, etc. That's an interesting observation. It could be that even if people up above weren't rattled by Reagan, people down below were, and therefore they were doing some things to get ready. So I would urge you to get that part of the story, nail that down if possible, and then put it into this context about the uncertainty of the evidence, not just as a historian today looking back, but the uncertainty of the evidence that these intelligence officers are having, trying to figure out from their side what is the US up to, and from our side is what are the Soviets up to with their alert activities.
Yeah. So let me address those, if I may, Scott, in reverse order, because I think the specific nature of intelligence sources are a real double-edged sword for historians and for all of us who look at the past. Because on the one hand, we see them and we get excited, right? This, this is the straight dope. Like, this is the real thing. We've got the intel people on this, not just those, State Department or DOD bureaucrats in their windowless offices. Sorry about that. But these are the intel people. The problem with this is that the intelligence community is a community so obsessively focused on compartmentalization and need to know that when we get intelligence sources, we are so often getting the sliciest of slicey sources, right? This is that's a term that book editor used for me about books, that there are cake books and there are slice books, right? Books that have do big stuff, they're just tiny ones. That's neither here nor there. The intelligence stuff is, we get so excited about it, right? We salivate for it. We spend countless.
We classified at one point.
Right, exactly. And this is, I forget who it was who wrote this. I think this was in Leon Panetta's memoir, where he says something about, when I left when I left government, I was so worried, like, what's life going to be like when I don't get PDBs every morning, when I don't get, all that awesome stuff. It's going to, that first morning is just going to be a real stinker. And then Panetta says something to the effect of, then I opened the New York Times and I kind of thought, it's not that big a deal. So, it's a really rich question, Scott. And let me just simply say that I do think that the PFIAB gets it wrong about the scale of the counter signaling, and I don't go into that. I think you're right in enough detail in the papers as circulated. And in terms of the broader kind of picture of Soviet policymaking, I situate in the book Able Archer in kind of this trend of the Soviets not really seeing the United States as all that threatening. That's why I mention Andropov and the risk of accidental nuclear war. Now, down the food chain, I would kind of just reference the comment that I made in response to Reed's really good question about confidence. And this is a pattern across tiers of actors in this. And I think also that the specific dates, and the timing of when the alert stops in the Soviet Union being right as the nuclear use phase starts in Able Archer, I think that's absolutely critical.
Well, that's not in the paper.
Is that not in? Okay, well then.
I think that timing question was, at least I missed it.
Okay, well, I think it's an important. On the exercises, in fact, the ones that the Soviets were the most unhappy about were not Autumn Forge. I mean, they didn't love Autumn Forge. No one did. The ones that they really didn't like were Canopy Wing and Ocean Venture. So Canopy Wing was the one which, if there was going to be a nuclear crisis, probably should have started it off. And I mentioned this canopy wing was basically the practice of flying B-52s straight at the Soviet Union and turning on a dime on attack paths and then turning on a dime. No one in the Soviet Union liked this, especially because it demonstrated real problems with their air defenses, problems with air defense which maintain, are still a major motivator of Russian strategy and doctrine today. And then Ocean Venture, which was a series of naval exercises which sent a message to the Soviet Union which they really didn't like, which was there's no such thing as geographically limited war anymore. If you mess around in the Fulda Gap, we're going to come after you in Vladivostok. If you are messing around on the border with China, who by the 1980s is really close relations between the US and between Washington and Beijing, we're going to come at you in the Baltic Sea. And so there's a great episode where William Crowe, who's chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who works in the same building, is in the office of his counterpart, Akhromeyev, whom I mentioned earlier, and Akhromeyev shows him a map. And Akhromayev's map has all of these American provocations, basically 360 degrees around the Soviet Union. And he says, look at how you test us, you push us at all angles, at all angles. It drives us absolutely insane, and we hate that you do this, he says to Crowe. And Crowe, as the story is recounted, just looks at him and says, well, I'm very glad to hear that. That I think kind of contextualizes this. Your point about I'll just wrap up and say your point about the European peace movements, extremely well taken. This was a big driver of this kind of Soviet intentional war scare atmosphere that they were mobilizing. It was in part about the domestic guns versus butter trade-off, and the absolute insistence by, in particular, the military leadership, who in the Soviet Union, like the military leadership, is also an economic actor, right? They control actual economic resources. They were adamant that they need to keep pumping resources in there, but also to fan the flames of the peace movement in Eastern Europe, which they, at least for a time, thought was going to do a lot of heavy lifting for them in terms of trying to stop NATO deployments. They were, as we know, ultimately wrong, and they were very embarrassed by it.
So, conscious of our time, what I think is maybe collect the last three people I have on my list before we started running out of time, which are Norman, Gabrielle, and Karthika, and maybe we can collect your questions and then you can respond as efficiently as possible. So
I promise I will. I'm sorry, that last one was...
I'm Norman Amark. I'm in the history department here at CSAC as well. Thank you for the good presentation. I was very curious about the documentation part because you say you're looking at it from the other side, but then I was struck. I didn't have a chance to read your paper. You said Prague, I think East Berlin, and Kiev. You didn't say much about Moscow.
Moscow, yeah.
So the real question is, and you also said there was an absence of discussion in the Politburo about this, but that sometimes happens. Sometimes things are not discussed in the Politburo. So my question then is, is there stuff in the Russian side that you say there might be a smoking gun somewhere, but are there archives that you would like to see, that might be helpful in trying to put this together, or do you think you saw everything you needed to see in order to put together from the Russian side? Again, Prague and East Berlin are one thing, but Moscow is another.
So Simon, sorry, I want to make sure everybody gets their issues on the table. So, and Gabrielle, you're up next.
I'm Gabrielle. I'm also in the history department, among other places. So I just wanted to get you to pull back from these details a bit. Kind of, stop looking at the slice and think about the cake. You said at the end, this case shows the importance of looking at archives elsewhere, and that's the good of international history. And that strikes me as a super Americanist perspective on the good of international history, because as you said in response to Reed and when you were talking about the oral histories, you're going at this question, you're posing a question from an American perspective and then going elsewhere to look at what archives somewhere else might show. And that's great. But what would happen if your question came from those other archives? I mean, what new questions could you generate by really taking those documents and the Soviet interlocutors on their own terms?
Last question.
Hi, Simon. Great talk. I have actually a very specific question. You said that when there were NATO exercises, the Soviets lowered their nuclear alert level. Did I hear that correctly?
That during the exercise, the Soviets lowered their nuclear alert level at the time at which the NATO exercise practiced shooting off the nuclear weapons.
Right. So that led me to think, it seems that the whole Able Archer thing to you has this characteristic of a fable, right? So it's believed because it speaks to what we thought that Moscow was like. It's governed by protocols and algorithms, and they're paranoid and they're going to react in this way. But throughout your talk, I kept getting these hints that, in fact, that it was the opposite, that they were extremely cautious. They were, they felt like they were being attacked. And so, since you are a historian of the 1980s overall, so I'm not asking specifically about this episode, but would you say that overall, Moscow and the decision makers in the nuclear realm in Moscow were actually less dependent on algorithms and more frightened and more defensive and therefore, in a way, maybe better stewards of the nuclear arsenal than were the decision makers in Washington?
So 3 great questions, and I have 3 paltry minutes. So let me underwhelm all 3 of you with my answers in rapid fire. So we do have the Politburo records, and actually we are living right now in an exciting time in Soviet history. And I know this isn't something I need to explain to you by any stretch of the imagination, but for the benefit of the room, is that huge quantities of documents are getting declassified in Moscow right now. Massive quantities. I don't really know why the Putin regime is doing this, but this is a great time to be a Soviet historian. Massive amounts of material from, in particular, the Archive of Contemporary History, RIaN, are opening up. The Foreign Policy Archive, the AVPRF, is becoming, at least we could say, less worse than they have been in the past about giving access. The outlier to this, the KGB archives. I do not know if I will live to see the day when we have good access to those materials. There's talk of 30 years from now. I will believe that when I see it. But let me just mention that for the Soviet perspective, we have actually a wide range of evidence. We have memoirs. We have fantastic oral histories, including a lot of them housed just, I think, that way at the Hoover Institution. There's a fantastic study which was commissioned by Andy Marshall over at the Pentagon of Soviet intentions. It's done by a defense contractor called BDM Federal, which is lengthy interviews with top Soviet military and national security policymakers. That's out there if anyone's interested somewhere on the internet. If you Google Soviet intentions BDM Federal, it'll come up. So when I point to documents like, for example, the Czech intelligence estimates, I do so because it was the Czechs and the East Germans who were given primary responsibility for watching what happened. And thus, I think that those are not just ancillary kind of second-tier sources. I think those are first-tier sources. But I also make that argument in concert with a wide range of documents straight out of Moscow, acknowledging your really good point, though, that the meetings of the Politburo were not as regular as perhaps we as historians might hope that they would have been. On the question of what would happen if we changed our perspective, so I love this question, and this is, as you say, a really slicey piece. The overall book is not just about this, of course. In the overall book, I try to write as much from the perspective of the Eastern Bloc actors, in particular the non-Soviet Warsaw Pact members. And the big question which motivates that, which is a question that matters, I think, from both perspectives, is why does this thing end? By the early 1980s, we're in a pretty comfortable holding pattern of Cold War. What are the choices that are made on both sides that lead to the largely peaceful end of the Cold War? And how do, in particular, Eastern Bloc actors steer Soviet policy not away from that outcome, but actually towards it?
Your next book.
Yes, yeah. And then finally, on the question of were the Soviets good stewards of their nuclear arsenal? Well, there are certainly some issues when it comes to preventative maintenance, which cut in the opposite direction, as we know. It seems to me that the main takeaway is yes. We can see a ton of conversations happening across the Soviet kind of national security community, where they're talking about, this is a very serious responsibility. And a lot of this is from Andropov. He talks a lot about the superpower responsibility. He uses this term a lot, the superpower responsibility. And that is the responsibility that people with nuclear weapons have. And their responsibility, and Andropov is explicit, is not to get overcome by emotions, is to behave like sane, rational people, and I believe I'm quoting him very accurately there, and to be responsible stewards of the awful and awesome power which they have. So actually, I come out of this project as a whole, and in particular the Able Archer period, with a strong sense that Soviet policymakers understood what they had in their control and took steps to stop things from getting out of control.
Well, please join me in thanking Simon. I think
Thank you.